There was a landfill built in the area, and we didn't really like the idea of a landfill being built on our doorstep. But it turned out that the company, the way that they was going to be nice to us, was actually going to give lots of funding back into the community, so to the schools and to the local groups. And so we sort of stuck our hand up and sort of said, well, can you sort of help fund planting some native plants in the area around our vineyards and sort of like on the roadsides and stuff like that. So that sort of happened. And then Lincoln sort of joined up and realised that this was a sort of good idea and sort of helped and provided a lot more proper information about what the local plants should be, and sort of proper sort of biodiversity and what should be growing, where it should be growing, so the right sort of plants in the right areas and things like that. They also, we went from using what you would traditionally normally use would be sort of like garden centre plants, which are all pretty much clones of the same plant. So most garden centres, if you go buy a plant, it's just going to be a cutting, so it's going to be exactly the same as all the other 20 plants in that row that were the same plant. Whereas all the plants that we're getting now are actually sourced from local seeds from being collected up in the hills, and so they are local, they are actual different plants, they're not all identical, and so there's a lot more proper material, a lot more diversity within the same species. We started planting, and quite a bit of funding, so lots of free plants, lots of very cheaper plants.
And you've developed this biodiversity trail here. Can you tell us about that?
Well, that's one of the ideas that Lincoln came up with, as well as actually putting in the plants into the area. So the basic idea was to actually plant native plants in and around our vineyards, which are essentially sort of like monocultures. There really is just grass, maybe a bit of clover and grapevines. There isn't that much diversity out there. And so what the idea was we could actually, in the areas that aren't being used for the grapevines, and as you can see, sort of like gullies and around the edges of places, that we can actually put natives in, and also just trying to create sort of corridors for the native animals to be able to travel. So from sort of bits of bush up in the hills over that side, there's nowhere for them to sort of bits of forest for actually them to travel through to get to the other bits of bush at the other side of the valley. The more the research side of it is to try and actually introduce native plants in and around the grapevines to actually help them grow better, grow more healthily, and to try to lessen the use of pesticides and fungicides and herbicides and things like that. And some of it's working. So they've been doing some research with sort of undercover crops that try and get sort of like parasitic flies and things that actually feed on some of the pests on the grapevines to actually encourage them into the area, so that you're going to sort of try to attack them. So that side's working. The one that's not really working, that we were one of the trials of, was actually under vine planting, that we're going to have native plants that will actually form more of a carpet and actually suppress weeds, so that we don't actually have to use herbicides to actually spray and keep the weeds down. But it's not growing as well as it should.
What are you using for that?
They were using, well, we've done a big trial. So the first 2 rows out here was a big trial. There was probably 10 different species of ground covers, and most of them, if you actually treated them like a normal horticultural crop, they don't suppress the weeds, or the weeds overgrow them and they don't work. They were using some very, very low-growing Hebes. The other one was the actual expense of doing it. So if we were going to plant one plant in between each of our grapevines down one of our rows, it was going to cost us $5 a plant, and a grapevine only cost us $5. So it's almost like doubling the cost of planting a vineyard. Native birds don't eat grapes. It's the introduced birds that eat grapes, and there is proven fact that the more native birds that you've got in the population in the area, the less overseas foreign birds are around. And so if you can actually plant native plants that have the fruit and the seeds that the native birds like, you're going to encourage the more native birds in the area.
So this glass, who has crushed it?
The Amberley Recycling Centre.
Yeah,
and it's cheap, it's like $40 for a tonne, and there's 3 tonne to go here all the way to the sign. It's down in West Melton. They've been doing trials underneath grapevines, a bit like what we were doing with the plants to suppress the weeds. They were trying to use the glass to actually sort of keep the weeds down, but also re-radiate some heat back up into the sunlight, back up into the grapevines.
What grapes are these?
Pinot.
Pinot Noir. The other one, these 2 rows have got the native trial on, and we haven't sprayed the weeds in these 2 rows for a couple of years. they produced so little grapes that we didn't actually pick these 2 rows. So there was actually too much competition from weeds.